audience for this special joint Australian Institute of International Affairs and University of Tasmania's College of Arts, Law and Education event on how sport can impact Australia's diplomacy. I'm Kim Boyer, I'm the State President of AIIA. In welcoming you here tonight, as a reflection of both the university's and AIIA's recognition of the deep history and culture of this island, we acknowledge and thank its traditional owners and custodians, the Palawa people. We pay respects to elders past and present. We pay respects also to those elders of the lands on which we are broadcasting. Now to our event tonight. The biggest ever FIFA Women's World Cup will kick off in Australia in July, and it is but one of several large sporting events in which Australia and its sporting teams can market our country to build diplomatic credibility. Sport has the power to change lives, and Australia is committed to use the power of sport to promote equality, diversity and inclusion. Big sporting events such as the Women's World Cup provide a unique opportunity to showcase a modern and diverse country where a quarter of our population were born overseas and 200 different ancestries are celebrated and represented in Australia. So just how do we use the common language of sport to strengthen our connections with regional and global players? And what will be the legacy of the green and gold decade? To respond to these challenging questions, we are really indeed fortunate to have with us well-known sports commentator and journalist, Stephanie Brantz. Steph is, among other roles, the chair of Australia's Sport Diplomacy Advisory Council. She's director of the Board of Football New South Wales, a member of the New South Wales Game Changers Council. I'd like to be part of that. And a former trustee of the Sydney Cricket and Sports Ground Trust, among other things. Stephanie switched to a media career with SBS in 2000 after starting work as a complementary medicine practitioner. She's now a freelancer. In addition to Stephanie, I welcome Aidan Cleghorn, who's the Tasmanian Alumni Ambassador for the new Colombo Plan, who'll be coordinating the Q&A session tonight with Greg Marshall. Aidan is going to manage for us the questions from the in-house audience and Greg the online questions. So online audience, you know about all of this with webinars. You don't need to be explained, but you use the Q thing at the bottom of the screen. I now have great pleasure in handing over to Stephanie. Welcome, Stephanie. It's great to have you, and subsequently to Aidan and Greg.
I can tell you would much rather be on the Sydney Cricket Ground Trust than the Game Changers Council. It's all changed with the change of government, as I'm sure everyone's aware has happened recently in New South Wales. Hello to all of you, and thank you so much for having me along tonight. Can I too acknowledge the Palawa people and their continuing spiritual and cultural connection to country. I acknowledge their elders past and present. Pay that respect to everyone of Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander, First Nations descent who's here with us in the room or joining us online. Thank you all for taking time out of watching the federal budget as well to come and listen to me tonight. As Kim mentioned, I'm chair of Australia's Sports Diplomacy Advisory Council, which was originally set up by Maurice Payne as Foreign Minister and continued now by Senator Wong. I've been involved in sports media, as Kim alluded to, for far too long, and Aidan reminded me just how long, more than 20 years, dating back to my early days at SBS Television, where I'd sit alongside the likes of Les Murray, Johnny Warren, Craig Foster in my first foray into television. What I remember as the highlight there, and I remember it very clearly, was when the Socceroos qualified for the 2006 FIFA World Cup in Germany. They put themselves back on the world stage for the first time in 32 years. And I followed sports for a long time, my entire life. I have European parents, and so I've followed football for a long time, but it was my first experience of crowds gathering in the early hours of the morning and being united and harmonious in their love for one sport and their pride in their country. So as Australians, we're used to doing pretty well at sport. We're used to being sleep deprived to follow our sporting stars. The Ashes of 2005 comes to mind as well, because I was still at SBS when they had the broadcast of that. Gripping down to the last ball of every test throughout the series. Ash Barty kept many awake during Wimbledon when she won a couple of years ago. Unfortunately, she kept me awake too because I was supposed to be there and COVID kept me at home. So I was broadcasting from my living room, which wasn't quite as exciting. But I think it was about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning when the Americans finally gave up on me and I pretended I was asleep. The scenes from Federation Square more recently, in the early hours of the morning and then latterly around the country following the Socceroos through into the round of 16 in the FIFA World Cup in Qatar when they came up against the eventual winners, Argentina. All of those events, we're used to gathering in numbers and being bleary-eyed, and now we have all these events set to come to our shores. We're proud of our successes on the world stage. We're proud of our achievements, but beyond our own delight and our love of sport is the key thing. It's the international language of sport and how effectively, excuse me, we use that to converse with the world. Sorry to everyone online. I've had 2 onion bhajis and they were delicious, but I don't know if to follow all of them. Now, this is sports diplomacy. It's speaking sport to the world, and it's far from a new concept. Some of you, many of you may be competent in understanding what ping pong diplomacy was. You'll remember that's been referred to for many years. The most well-known story is of the US receiving an invitation to visit China. They received that at the 1971 World Championships. We're actually in Nagoya in Japan, and they received an invitation to go to China. And what happened after that was the president of the US at the time, who was Richard Nixon, he took the team over. And that was seen as breaking down barriers and a real diplomatic mission between the US and China. Less highly publicised was the invitation extended to the Australian table tennis team at the time. It was extended by the Chinese government, and on Wednesday, the 21st of April in 1971, the green and gold team indeed travelled to Beijing, and Australia had its own part in ping pong diplomacy, and they initiated that with matches, training sessions, and a couple of cultural events as well. That's a very simplified version of the Australian involvement, and I encourage you, if you're interested, to look it up and read it. It's quite fascinating. However, the tour did play a really important part in China opening their borders to the Western world and better diplomatic relations. As we know, that's cooled somewhat in recent years, but that was an example of early on. There's many examples of sports diplomacy, some with more success than others. I think Nelson Mandela and his contribution in that space is well known to everyone. I remember the 1995 Rugby World Cup, and South African rugby, as we know, was historically a white man's sport. And to see their newly elected president walk onto the field to present the trophy in Francois Pienaar's Springbok jersey was extraordinary. And it went some way to uniting the population, a divided population in shared national pride. And he underlined this in a speech when he said, "Sport has the power to change the world. It has the power to inspire. It has the power to unite people in a way that little else does. It speaks to youth in a language they understand. Sport can create hope where there was only despair. It's more powerful than government in breaking down racial barriers." And it was so true. There's plenty of other instances as well. The Miracle on Ice with the US and Soviet Union ice hockey teams, the Korean Peninsula joint team, 2018 in Pyeongchang at the Winter Olympics, if you remember that one, all with varying degrees of success. But what they do is they demonstrate how sport can be used as a tool for diplomacy. It can bring people and nations together in ways that transcend politics and cultures. Now, it's been a key pillar of Australia's foreign policy for years. We're known globally, as I mentioned, for our love of sport and a long history of sporting achievement, including, I'm sure you could all name them, successes in the likes of cricket, rugby, netball, tennis, swimming. We could probably go on. I'm still waiting for Australia to win a Football World Cup, but I might be waiting a wee while unless the Matildas can do it this year. But we've been able to use sport to promote our nation brand, to promote peace and stability, facilitate dialogue and exchange, and break down barriers, foster goodwill, and forge partnerships around the world. So in 2015, DFAT launched its first sports diplomacy strategy that recognised the capacity of Australian sport to be able to enhance Australia's national interests, to deepen Australia's people-to-people connections, institutional links and advanced development outcomes within the region, celebrating Australia's sport capability and the credentials, our leadership in sport education, and that goes currently as far as things like sport technology as well. It will also recognise the ways in which sport strengthens diplomatic influence and global reputation. So I came in more along the lines of this second updated sports diplomacy strategy, which is Sports Diplomacy 2030, very original name, I know. It builds on the success of the first, and it now outlines how sport can help achieve foreign policy goals. So there's 4 pillars to this, and the strategy focuses on empowering Australian sport to represent Australia globally. It talks about building linkages with our neighbours, maximising trade, tourism and investment opportunities, and strengthening communities, particularly in the Indo-Pacific region and beyond, which I think you'll know is a particular focus and has been of this government for some time. Now, in line with the first of those pillars, which was empowering Australia to represent the country on the world stage, we collaborated with La Trobe University's Centre for Sport and Social Impact, and we created the world's first sports diplomacy MOOC. Is anyone aware of that? You can all go sit it when you go home tonight. A MOOC obviously is the massive open online course. I'm sure you're all familiar with that. It's free. It's designed for anyone who's been involved or is involved in sport and politics. And what it does is it wants to empower participants with an understanding of Australia's sporting values and the soft power potential of sport, and also for our athletes how to be a good ambassador for Australia through sport. However, I think we understand the concept of whenever, and we tell our athletes this all the time, when you put on the green and gold, no matter where you are, you're an ambassador for the country. And we've had various instances where there's been, let's call it poor behaviour. And obviously that's something that we don't want reflected. So we encourage them to remember that they're an ambassador for the country whenever they go and compete, even though they think sometimes they're just playing sport or competing. So I want to touch on the other 3 pillars, all of which can be, I guess we'll call it turbocharged through our green and gold decade through to 2032. This runway or decade presents Australia with a significant opportunity to leverage its sports diplomacy strategy. There's so many opportunities coming up to build relationships, promote Australia on the international stage through the hosting of an extensive series of major international events, including the upcoming FIFA Women's World Cup kicking off in 72 days. It's very close. And of course, that decade will culminate in the Olympic and Paralympic Games in 2032 in Brisbane. So we're going to have a look at those opportunities and what they mean, particularly for people with an interest in international affairs. There's always, of course, going to be the formal gatherings and those formal meetings. In fact, Quad 2023 is coming up in just over a couple of weeks. That one's the diplomatic partnership between Australia, India, Japan, and the USA. What they are is they're all committed to supporting an open and stable, prosperous Indo-Pacific that's inclusive and resilient. All very worthy words. But what I love about it, these are all countries that are very fluent in the language of sport. So between rugby, soccer, cricket and the Olympics and Paralympics, we should be having myriad opportunities to meet informally. And that's how I see sport diplomacy working. It's not the formal sit-down meetings where you arrange to create policy. It's the meeting you have, watching a match that you both love, your countries are coming together and you get the chance to speak informally about whatever it is you're going to do, and then you arrange to have the really boring meeting the next day. That's how I see it working. I'm not sure the government sees it exactly the same, so yeah, maybe don't repeat that. So hosting these World Cups, these major international sporting events allow us to showcase Australia's world-class facilities. Our infrastructure, our hospitality, demonstrate our commitment to supporting sport and physical activities at all levels, and it does so in an inclusive manner. We bring people together from diverse backgrounds, from diverse cultures, and we promote understanding and cooperation of a range of issues, from sport to trade to cultural issues and cultural exchange. So building relationships, promoting Australia, and that's as we want to promote ourselves as a modern, dynamic and welcoming country. Don't know if any of you heard Matt Carroll, AM, the head of the AOC, speak at the National Press Club not so long ago. He threw out an idea that he thought sport should be its own department in government. And it was quite an interesting one. There was a lot of debate afterwards, but whether the outcome of his suggestion and or your opinion on the matter is different to his. One thing about sport, if you look at all the facets, it touches every portfolio in government, and it is the one thing that has the ability to reach everyone, whatever they do. So diplomatic relations aside, fans of a sport love to attend world sporting events. Who here's been to a world sporting event? Quite a few. The others, I hope you've watched one on TV. You'll be very bored for the next 20 minutes. Now, I've been a fan of a lot of sports for a long time. I spent 10 years at ABC working on what we call multi-sport, just a myriad of sport. And ABC itself went through a green and gold period where everything we did was just national events. So Champions Trophy hockey, we did the Wallabies, we did the Opals, we did the Diamonds, every other Australian icon that I can think of, as well as Matildas and Socceroos. But I've always viewed sport as the ideal way when I travel somewhere to see and get to know a country, a city, a village, and really see what makes it tick. And obviously I go a lot of places for work, but it's also interesting to see what brings the fans together. I've been to a FIFA World Cup in Russia, more recently in Qatar. I went on a delegation to Saudi Arabia with the Asian Football Confederation the year before last. These are countries that weren't necessarily, or at any time, on my tourism bucket list. They weren't places that I was wanting to go and see, but through sport and obviously work, I got to know a little bit about those countries, and more than I ever could through a newspaper headline, which I then found quite instructive and really interesting in relating to the people that I met. So I was based in Kazan for the 2018 World Cup in Russia. I was following the Socceroos for ESPN. And the one thing I found the most interesting, because we'd read all these headlines before we left about how Putin was going to get rid of all the stray dogs, he was going to take all the unwanted people, and you were only going to see the perfect Russia, as it were. I had, I think, probably about 15, 16 Uber drivers while I was there. Every single one of them was so anxious to know what I thought of their town, what I thought of their country. Did we think the people were friendlier than he saw in the headlines he was reading? He said, we're not cruel, we're not dour, we're not grumpy. He said, do you like it here? And they were so keen to show their country in a favourable light as people. Nothing to do with the sport, just you're visiting. What do you think? In Saudi, I spoke to so many women. Spoke to them in a professional capacity, and I went and spoke to some women wandering around when I was at the Riyadh Festival, which reminds me a little bit of the lights and bells and whistles festivals we have here. It was so far from what I expected. These were women running departments, women in control of programs within storied historical sporting clubs. There was infrastructure being built to cater for women who were suddenly allowed to play sport and then being encouraged to play sport. I met the coach of the newly created Saudi women's national football team, Monica Starb. She was fascinating. She's from Germany originally, and she's worked with the female football programs in Bahrain, in Qatar, in Lebanon, and through the Gulf region. And she spoke so eloquently about the power of sport to affect change. She spoke about the power of sport as a common language, as an opportunity, and she emphasised that sport was the way to bring people to a country so they could experience it. And she said this with their own eyes. She said, you cannot know until you see it with their own eyes. Now, Saudi Arabia, possibly in the sporting world, is a bit of an extreme example to use. It has a, let's call it, complex relationship with sport. And if you witnessed the Live Golf recently in Adelaide as well, you'll see that there's a real tussle between the investment in sport and the perception of the country. But what I wanted to underline was sport took me to a country I had no reason or desire to visit, and I formed some really important relationships with some incredible women doing amazing things, to the extent that we invited one of these women, who must have been all of 20-something, to the Dubai Expo to speak at our round table on sports diplomacy at the, what was it, a couple of years ago now. And she was incredible. It was Saudi sport for all. And we weren't talking just sport, we were talking inclusion sport. And they were doing inclusion properly. And I was fascinated by that, given the barriers she must face compared to what we face here when we're doing the same sort of thing. So our sport diplomacy, it's not all flowers and loveliness. While it's been used successfully in many instances, there are some places it hasn't worked as intended. And I think we actually need to recognise that sometimes all the best intentions don't mean that you're going to get the result that you want. The ping pong diplomacy I mentioned earlier, the exchange of the table tennis players between the US and China was successful in breaking down some barriers, but that ended up being as far as it went. There was no ongoing diplomatic outcome. North Korea and South Korea's joint team in the 2018 Winter Olympics, it was a great show of unity between the two countries, and I think everyone will remember the headlines over that. Unfortunately, it didn't lead to a significant change, as we know, in that relationship either. And Russia, Qatar, Saudi, their relationship with sport and using sport to boost their image, as I mentioned, is a trickier situation. However, the discussion on sports washing is a completely different presentation. Maybe another time, Kim, you can invite me back and we'll have a grand debate on that. However, the examples highlight why it's the opportunity that sport is offering Australia in the next decade that is so important that we maximise it. We need to utilise it before it's too late, and we need a long-lasting impact. So we're coming off a slightly different base because most people laugh. As we saw in the hosting of the Sydney Olympics 2000, were you alive?
Yeah.
I don't know if any of you attended that. Did anyone go to the Sydney Olympics? Because I remember being a volunteer there, and I'll stop picking on youngsters. I remember being a volunteer there, and everyone was happy. I think basically the state governor told everyone to get out of town so there wouldn't be traffic jams. It was just the best 2 weeks. And so much fun. Australia collectively put on their happiest face. It was a way to showcase our fantastic facilities, our warm and friendly people, and as a result, the entire country was bathed in the halo of these Olympic Games. The event attracted millions of people, it generated billions in revenue, and we got a huge boost as a country on the international stage, irrelevant to the city. So major sporting events done right have that significant economic impact. They have tourism, they have hospitality, generating new opportunities for investment and trade, and further, and most importantly, strengthening those ties with other countries, which is also important. So it's good delivery of those events is key. And what it can do is can help our diplomatic policies get a real lift, whether it's, say, investment or trade or strengthening ties or human rights, democracy, advocating for action on climate change or perhaps sustainability. The other thing is the developing world is getting increasingly obese, and I'm not just talking all of us that stacked on 10 kilos over COVID, but it's becoming a worldwide problem in developed countries. So the events on the green and gold runway, they're perfectly placed for us to be able to promote health and well-being. Sport, obviously, has long been recognised as an effective tool in addressing physical and mental health, as well as social inclusion and cohesion. So for countries that are grappling with these issues, it's an opportunity for us to have a platform to promote initiatives and healthy lifestyles and social development. Even further, and if anyone's sick of hearing about women's sport, close your ears for the next 5 minutes, because a lot of our events on this green and gold runway are female specific. They are women's sports. So with all those events to take place on our shores in the coming years, it is the perfect opportunity for us to show that we are promoting gender equality in sport. We can address issues of discrimination, issues of social exclusion. And by hosting something like the FIFA Women's World Cup, we can raise awareness about the importance of that, the importance of recognising that, and the opportunities for female athletes to showcase their talent, inspire future generations, and in that I include all abilities. When we're talking about the inclusivity, we're talking about our para-athletes, we're talking about the athletes who have acquired brain injuries, anyone that wants to play sport, everyone should be welcome, and it's our chance to put that out there. I worked on the FIBA Women's Basketball World Cup, which was actually the start of our green and gold runway. So that was at the end of last year. They actually have another one coming up, probably less publicised. The female basketballers have the FIBA Asia Cup, which is in, I think it's about 3 or 4 weeks' time. So during that green and gold decade, I think Australia is going to showcase the excellence of women's sport through at least 5 different major events. The basketball that I mentioned, the Women's Football World Cup coming up, the 2026 Commonwealth Games will feature our women, the 2027 Netball World Cup, and the Women's Rugby World Cup in 2029. The largest of these, as Kim alluded to in an introduction, is the FIFA Women's World Cup 2023. Now, it would be unkind of me not to note that we are co-hosting with New Zealand. I know here we keep saying we have the Women's World Cup, but we are sharing it. It is the biggest ever FIFA Women's World Cup. It kicks off on July the 20th and goes for a month thereafter. First time the tournament has been held in the Southern Hemisphere. First time the tournament has been expanded from 24 to 32 teams. And just to give you a very quick rundown, in Australia, it will be Australia, Ireland, Nigeria, Canada, England, Haiti, Denmark, China, France, Jamaica, Brazil, Panama, Germany, Korea, Colombia, and Morocco. The other half will be in New Zealand, and should they extend their stay in the tournament long enough, they'll end up in Australia for the final. It's the second most watched major sporting event in the world, 2.5 billion viewers. Although if anyone's aware of current events, you'll be asking what's happening with the FIFA broadcast deal. That's a question for later, but it gets a huge number of eyeballs. It presents a real opportunity for Australia to market itself to the world, to harness the audience, to build economic and diplomatic value, and help drive social change through empowering women and girls globally. The trophy tour is actually already underway. It started in February in Japan. I think overnight it's making its way from Norway to Ireland. Ireland are World Cup debutantes. So it'll be really exciting for them when that trophy arrives in Dublin. There are 6 debutantes in this World Cup, and that trophy will go to each of the 32 participating countries on its way to, it'll end up in New Zealand for the opening ceremony. The Australian government has been fortunate because we've been able to engage with FIFA and be able to have some events planned around this. So we've been able to promote Australia to the world already through the trophy tour. At the same time, the Secretary General of FIFA, Fatma Samora, she's been travelling around Australia, checking things out before it kicks off in a couple of months' time. Now, she's a former diplomat with the UN, quite an extraordinary woman. She knows a bit about the importance of having a voice. She's adamant that football has the strongest voice in the sporting world. And this week she said, "Football is the rare sport that has the power to cross warring cultural groups as a universal language that brings unparalleled levels of joy even to people who are enduring incredible hardship." She believes nothing else in the world, including UN peacekeepers and good-natured politicians, can do what football does for African countries. In a dreary world, a hungry world, a scared world, football provides a wonderful sense of relief and joy and hope. She says for women, it helps fight gender bias, promotes self-esteem, confidence, health and well-being, and promotes female empowerment. That's a hell of a lot for 22 players running around a field for 90 minutes. However, such is the power of the message that sport can bring, and big tournament sport, which is why it's so wonderful that we're hosting. I was saying to Alessa on the way over, I said, people keep asking, because they know that I've done a few Women's World Cups, how excited are you that the World Cup's coming down under? And for me, it's actually quite funny because it's wonderful to be hosting and everything that entails, but a World Cup normally means an overseas trip for me. I'm going to Brisbane. But I grew up there, so my parents are very happy. Now, we are primed to elevate all of these messages during the FIFA Women's World Cup. The government has a commitment to harnessing the power of sport to promote gender equality, creating leadership pathways, and increasing the participation of women and girls in sport, supporting women and girls to realise their full potential through sport across our region. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the funding set up through sport that the government already does. We have 2 pathways. One is sport for development, and one is our elite sport. So Team Up is our flagship sport for development program, which promotes women's participation in grassroots sports, mainly through the Pacific region. And Pacific Oz Sports is the elite version of that. What we do is we create pathways for elite athletes from the Pacific to compete in Australia and internationally. And we support emerging Pacific athletes with things like high performance training. If any of you are familiar with the GAPS program that Griffith University in Queensland rolled out, that's the perfect example. We help to gather, attain, prepare and sustain athletes. And we've already had huge successes with those athletes at Com Games, which sounds counterintuitive when we're creating pathways for other countries' athletes to be better than ours, but I think that's probably a sign of the success of the program if you've been able to create that environment for them. And it's been so wonderful to see. I watched our own enemies walking around talking to the athletes who are just, blown away that this legend of Olympic sport was there, working with them, and not just on their physical preparation, but their mental preparation and how they approach elite sport. Because for some of these athletes, it looks very different in their country. We were talking earlier about the training for the Drua in Fiji, how that looks when they're there and how it looks when they're in the facilities here. The FIFA Women's World Cup also provides us with that unique opportunity to showcase our modern and diverse country and highlight the rich heritage of our First Nations people, something we traditionally, I feel, have not done so well. As you know, and Kim mentioned also in her intro, we're a highly diverse country, over 300 different languages and dialects spoken on our shores. A quarter of the population born overseas, 200 different ancestries, and we have a long history in multiculturalism and diversity. I'm a first-hand result of one of those programs that the government has had. I was born in Brisbane to Dutch Indonesian parents who took advantage back in the 60s of one of those opportunity schemes that the Australian government offered. Excuse me. The country's success in promoting and really supporting multiculturalism has actually allowed us to become one of the most socially and culturally diverse nations in the world. And it means now we share so much common ground with so many other countries. And that's what makes these opportunities so unique. One thing, as I alluded to, that's not always been highlighted in our past is the broad range of Indigenous communities. Our First Nations people, each with their own unique culture, their own language and their own customs. As you know, I'm sure you know, unless you've been living under a rock, you're aware there's commitments now to addressing this. The Australian government has made it clear that they're committed to implementing the Uluru Statement from the Heart in full and embedding First Nations perspectives, experiences and interests into our foreign policy. And I think that needs to be folded into our sporting strategy as well. Because what this is going to do is it's going to strengthen the Indo-Pacific region, bring people together and address shared challenges, particularly around health-based perspectives. So it's not a moment too soon. It's an element of our national power. It enhances our interactions with our regional and global partners. So as far as diplomacy goes, First Nations people were our country's first traders and diplomats. They've got skills honed over thousands of years, but they haven't been fully acknowledged. On the sporting front, and I guess specific to the Matildas, we've got the likes of Lydia Williams, Kaya Simon, Jada Wyman, all proud Indigenous women, and they're just perfect as ambassadors of why we should be embracing our Indigenous athletes and creating pathways, recognising their culture and heritage. So throughout the World Cup, Australia must demonstrate its commitment to creating a far more inclusive and welcoming environment, not just for our Indigenous athletes, but the fans and those wanting to work in various other areas in sport. So what we need is a multifaceted approach, because we've got a suite of opportunities in this tournament and beyond, all the way through to those games that now seem so far away, the Olympic and Paralympic Games, but they'll come up very, very quickly. So how do we determine if our sports diplomacy strategy has been successful? It's that overused word, legacy. And everyone talks about a legacy. They talk about creating a legacy and what's the legacy impact and what are you doing in the legacy space? What legacy basically means to me from a sporting perspective is impact. Does it have a long-term impact that extends beyond the tournament? So hosting international sporting events obviously can have a significant impact on the country and its people. If a legacy left behind is one that extends into, I would say, a decade at least later, then you've had a significant impact. So there's a few of those that are important. One of them, and I think it's the obvious one, is infrastructure. So infrastructure is everything built for the event. We're talking stadiums, arenas, transportation networks and other facilities. You guys know all about building a stadium because you've been all over the news. Don't mention the stadium. But if you look at, say, the Olympic Games in London in 2012, they were a success both in terms of the event, but also in terms of the legacy. The Olympic Park in East London, I don't know if any of you were able to travel over to see the games over there. It was actually a rundown area and they turned it into a world-class sporting venue. And it's now got new infrastructure, new transport links, housing developments. And after the event, the park was turned into a public park. It's got places to play, sport facilities, walking and cycling routes. It's really fantastic what they've done for that. And also with the regeneration in that area. The other one is social and economic benefits, and a particular one here I think of when we think of the South Africa 2010 World Cup. That was really fascinating because it was seen as a country that was going to have trouble being ready to deliver that particular tournament. But it included increased tourism, job creation, revenue for local business. It was a major success for the country and the continent as a whole. It was regarded as this positive force for social change. And I recall going over there, when you say don't mention the war, this was when Australia was bidding to host a men's World Cup. I don't know if you remember how well that went. But at the time we were still courting the votes of other members. And we were taken all over the place. But the one I specifically remember was we went into Soweto, into a little village. I think one of the people in our party had a nanny that came from that area and she said, would you like to come home and meet my family? And there were kids playing in the street with just rolled up balls of clothes as their football, but the country was just alight with this Football World Cup and everyone was so engaged and it was just all smiles and this really heartwarming feeling. You knew it wasn't always like that, but it brought this real energy and attention to perhaps some of the parts of their country that needed a little bit of work. And I think significant investments also in public transport, road networks, housing developments, all those things were built for the event and they had a long-lasting legacy for that country. More obvious perhaps is the cultural exchange. Again, in South Africa, this was more stark than perhaps it might be here. But the cultural exchange between countries and the participating countries. I've named the 16 countries that will be coming first to Australia. Of the 16 that are going to compete in New Zealand, I know of at least 3 that will be coming through Australia first for training matches and as a posting stage. So the opportunity to interact with those cultures, for them to learn about our cultures, our customs and our tradition it's not quite for us a once in a lifetime opportunity, but for some of those countries, it will be one of the only times they come as a national team to Australian shores. So South Africa saw a massive increase in the cultural exchange programs between the country and the participants. They got to promote their cultural heritage, and that's something I really enjoyed. All the music and the dancing and the colour that you expect to go around something on the African continent was all there, and they really embraced it, and I think all the tourists absolutely loved it as well. Sport development is probably another obvious one that you need to have in your legacy. Hosting international sporting events should mean you're developing sporting facilities, sporting programs. You want increased participation in sport and improved facilities for your athletes. I worry that if we get the projected uptake in participation of women and girls in football, we're not going to have enough facilities for them. We are already in New South Wales struggling to hold all the girls playing football and have enough changing facilities and things like that for the girls that are sick of changing in your car in the car park or those sorts of things. And getting that equaliser program going where we have female-friendly facilities has been really tricky. So while you want this uptake, you need these sports facilities to balance at the same time. The games in Glasgow in 2014, the Com Games, they're a really good example of a legacy left behind. It was a catalyst for their community and regeneration. There was a range of legacy projects also implemented after the event, which turned out to be a really positive thing. They got new facilities, they got new improved public spaces, programs for community engagement in sport, and those community-led projects were actually targeted to improve the lives of the local residents. So it had nothing to do with the big picture. It was all about at a grassroots level, making sure everyone's lives were better through sport. Tourism and international relations, I think, is the one we all think of when you talk of bringing the world to your shores, particularly for sport. 2019 Rugby World Cup in Japan, I think, was an interesting one. There was so much that they put into the tourism aspect. They wanted people around. I think it was, if you think of that whole COVID era, it was probably fortunate that it went ahead, but they invested heavily in new infrastructure. They made sure their new transport links were up to scratch to make sure that visitors could travel easily and everything would go smoothly. They increased interest in the country as a tourist destination once more, and they had a real boost to the economy, which does come with having thousands of visitors travelling to your country for an event. It's one of the events that I wish I'd gone to, because I think Japan does events very well, but obviously with the Rugby World Cup, I certainly wasn't travelling then, and then with the Tokyo Olympics, none of us could go. So hopefully the next time they hold something, I'll be able to get over there. Then we got the legacy projects. That's the last pillar that I wanted to talk to. The legacy products, the impact products. The 2018 Winter Olympics springs to mind, Pyeongchang. They got new parks, hospitals, social programs that benefited the whole community. Ditto the FIFA World Cup in Brazil. That was used as a way to promote social and environmental development. They had a range of legacy products that were planned well in advance, and they were implemented after the event. Public transport seems to be a continuing factor with all of these, and I don't know whether it's their countries. I'm fervently hoping that Sydney's public transport gets better with the inclusion of major events, but it's certainly been something that's been a factor in countries like Brazil and South Africa, and as I mentioned, Japan just went next level with theirs. The one thing interesting about Brazil, they also had an increased interest in environmental awareness and social issues. So they had community-led projects and initiatives that were aimed at promoting a sustainable development and reducing poverty, which is a balance that was really key to the policies in their country. So as a socially and culturally diverse nation, we have this unique opportunity to use the common language of sport and to collate all those ideas. Australia can use the FIFA Women's World Cup as that platform for sports diplomacy to achieve diplomatic gain in several ways. The common language of sport can strengthen connections, as I mentioned, with regional and global partners, promotes cultural understanding, social inclusion, and cooperation. So there's a few points that I think specific to the FIFA Women's World Cup that we can look at. Cultural exchange is the first one. That's an obvious one. We can do cultural events, exhibitions, festivals, showcase our unique identity and our heritage, and really promote that First Nations culture. And when I remember how well South Africa did this, it's a chance that shouldn't be missed. Gender equality, inclusion and diversity is something that's already on our agenda, and I think we have an opportunity now to really elevate that. The government can use the event to highlight its policies, its initiatives around gender equality, to advocate for girls' and women's rights around the world. We're bringing people here and we want to show them best practice and what should be available for women and girls in their country. What I think is key though in this needs to be more than just a one-time event around the World Cup. We need to invest in initiatives. We need to promote support of women and their competition and their participation from grassroots all the way to elite. And this may include programs to increase participation, to increase training, to leverage the interest of women in coaching and refereeing in sports governance and those sorts of things. There has to be a whole suite of initiatives that are put into play to make this truly successful. And when I mention diversity and inclusion, it's key to remember that that means sport for all, and football prides itself on being a sport for all. So it's key that all are celebrated and all are included. For our bilateral relations, the World Cup provides an opportunity for us to strengthen those relationships by participating countries. I mentioned it before, hosting meetings, symposium, think tanks, and this applies to the entire country, because I can't imagine for a second someone's coming all the way to Australia and only going to a game in Sydney or a game in Melbourne or Adelaide or whatever. You know, why wouldn't it? It would be on my bucket list coming from overseas. I've seen the beautiful scenery, the wine, the cheese, the chocolate, the hiking in Tasmania. And if you're on this side of the world, it should be marketed, and there should be an opportunity to have those sorts of events in every city in the country. And that goes for tourism promotion as well, which was my next point. Use the event to promote tourism for the entire country. They should be going to the top end as well. We all know how expensive it is to travel around Australia. Just don't tell them how far it is. I don't know how many of you have friends that have come over from Europe and said, oh, I'm just going to drive to Cairns. And you're like, I'll see you in 2 weeks. The economic benefit, this obviously will provide a boost to the entire economy. The influx of visitors, it will be expected that they will spend on hotels, on restaurants, on local business. It's important that businesses are able to leverage the opportunities to sell their brands. And I'm thinking trade shows, again, trade festivals, investment seminars, those sorts of events that you just take advantage of the time when you have this captive audience on your doorstep. In Australia, there will only be one game that they go to on that day. So there's a lot of opportunity to be able to get these visitors interested in other things. The one thing I think about sports diplomacy that to me is key is the people-to-people exchange as well. I read a story when I was waiting for the plane today, and it was on AI. And I'm a big fan of the whole new AI thing where you can ask it a question and it'll write you an essay. I'm like, oh, I love that. I wish it was around when I was at university. However, I shouldn't say that any university should be. But I was reading a story on this, what they were saying, AI next level. And it was the chatbot that can create a task list and then do the task list. And this man had used it to, the case study was he'd asked it to look at investments and create a graph or a spreadsheet. And this bot basically went in, it created all the information. It said, oh, you know, I don't know how to do a spreadsheet. So it downloaded the information it needed to do its spreadsheet. Then to do the graph, it didn't have that language, had to convert that. So it downloaded that. It debugged the system, put it onto the computer and created this whole thing, and then started on the side asking itself new questions about this investment. What if they diversified into X or Y? Which is where it was quite scary, because the key of this article was how long till we're all replaced. and it was frightening at how intelligent, you know, how long would it be before this thing was smarter than humans, which was probably yesterday. However, one thing it did remind me was that in something like sports diplomacy, that can never be replaced. There's esports, you still need a person to operate it, but there's still that person-to-person contact. And that is where sports diplomacy can only ever be done by creating those relationships. And the people-to-people contact of having all these visitors, whether they're high levels of government or royal families or tourists in their shorts and t-shirts and flip-flops and whatever, coming to support this tournament, that's where you get to make these connections. And the exchange between Australia and the participant countries is something that we have the advantage of knowing. We have 10 years of events. We can start, if we didn't already with the Basketball World Cup, we can start with the FIFA Women's World Cup and then carry on from there. They'll be back next year for X. They'll be back in 2 years for netball, then for rugby, then so on, all the way through to Brisbane 2032, and you can build that relationship. We'll be hosting things like Football for Hope, the Festival of Football, where that's a program designed to bring in people who work in those spaces of opportunity for third world countries and be able to arm them with the tools to take the programs back to their countries. They're all very important. Also the educational exchange, which, as I said, we are sitting in a university, and I think that's going to be key to get the international linkages between universities, bring the students in. You know, you can do something around the World Cups or the sporting events or the Olympics or the Paralympics, and house them in the university, talk to them about the education programs and see what relationships you can build there. Provides them the opportunity to learn about our culture, our education system, and then build a long-lasting relationship, which also is a sharing of ideas. So it involves our students being able to go over and study. And we were talking about the DFAT programs that we can enable that now. So this is the whole thing. Shouldn't say on steroids when you're talking about sport, but bigger and better, and something that can enhance our education system as well. So if Australia delivers on all those fronts, and I only gave you a quick 7 points that we need to address in the next 72 days, we should do it. And to cap it all off, it needs to be sustainable. That's one of the key things now about World Cup. So I thought it was quite funny when I was in Qatar, and it's an interesting one when I came back, like, what was it like? I said, well, the football was great. So as an actual World Cup, it was fantastic. I was fascinated by their stadiums. They had a stadium that was actually packed down and shipped off to other countries. Afterwards, it was built of shipping containers. Absolutely fascinating. However, because of the lack of accommodation available just to the sheer size of the city, there were planes flying in and out from Dubai, like shuttle buses. I was thinking, there's going to be a balance here somewhere. And I think that Australia will need to find that. We'll need to find a way that the World Cup is sustainable and it doesn't have a negative impact on the local communities. I think hosting a major event is always going to take some sort of infrastructure and resources quite significantly. So it's pretty essential that these are used in a way that is environmentally and also socially responsible, which always sounds easy when you talk about it, doesn't it? To address this challenge, I think we're going to need to prioritise sustainability in the planning, and it already has been started. There is actually a department with our local organising committee that is about the sustainability. We need to use renewable energy sources, reduce waste, carbon emissions. That needs to be considered. And indeed, when you're planning an event now, that is a strategic part of your policy that you need to actually include. So we can look at green infrastructure or community development initiatives. But basically, what we're getting is an opportunity to do this time and time and time again. That Olympics that we had that was so successful 23 years ago, when people talk about the Sydney Olympics, I kind of think, wasn't that long ago, 2.5 decades ago. And now we're getting an opportunity to put on a repeated amount of these events all the way through to those Olympics in Brisbane. However, to do it effectively, they need to be more than just a week, more than just a fortnight, more than just a month of incredible sporting feats. Through diplomacy, we can make it count forever, and it's an opportunity that we really, really shouldn't waste. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Steph. I'm now passing over to Aidan and to Greg over there for the Q&A.
Was it better than the budget or not?
Yeah. I suppose I'll be selfish and start off. With the success we've had as a sporting nation, I think it's going to the women's, the winning gold at the Olympics last year with our sevens team. It was gold. I hope it was.
Yeah.
And the Matildas lifting the World Cup in 3 months.
Oh, you're very bolshy.
How will we stop embarrassments like our World Cup performance last year, the 22 World Cup against New Zealand with the Wallaroos, where they were the better team for 50 minutes, but we're outfit?
That's the fun of sport, isn't it? That is absolutely the fun of sport. I've got this interesting debate going. You refer to the Matildas lifting the World Cup. I think one thing that we're prone to do is that we, perhaps because we're so far away from the rest of the world, we do see ourselves in a bubble. And of course, the Matildas are going to win the World Cup. Quite aside from the fact that we have Canada, who are the Olympic champions in our group, our crossover, once we get out of our group, if we get out of our group, is quite likely to be with England, who are the Euro champions last year. And the women's football world is actually really, really tough. I actually made a note because I wanted to remind myself of the ranking. So we're ranked 10th in the world. The USA is first. They'll start in New Zealand. We won't meet them till the finals, hopefully. We hope. Teams like Sweden and so on, and Germany and those sorts of countries, you've got to play well on the day. And I don't see it as an embarrassment, and I don't think that there's an Australian team alive that would not go out and give it their all. But similarly, when you talk about the Wallaroos, and I would never discount New Zealand at any of the rugby codes, kind of like that. They're always a force to be reckoned with. But Australia, the women went to the Asian Cup last year, and there was a strong expectation that they would be in the final, if not lift it for a second time. And they bowed out in the quarterfinals to South Korea again. And I think that's something as a country that we actually then need to have humility.
I suppose more the embarrassment is how poorly we have treated the development of women's sports. Specifically, rugby Australia is private, but how can we, I guess, strong arm the development and force codes? Like, force is probably not the right word, but make it so that codes will spend more time in the development of women's sports.
The way I see this, and this may not be the way everyone thinks is the correct way, is that women's sport has come from nothing, and we are, so say here, and men's sports here, but men's sports been going for over 100 years, and we need to walk before we can run. We could do with more funding, we could do with more programs, and we could do with more elite pathways, but they have been built through in recent years. What I'm worried about now, and this is going to get very boringly specific about sport, is that we have women who are going from playing socially, playing grassroots, then playing sort of, say, regional or tier 2 comps, to playing professional, particularly football codes in either rugby's, AFL and soccer, and their bodies are breaking down because they will play for 8 weeks and then they'll go back to a life where they have to work. So we need to implement full-time programs for these athletes that they are just athletes, and then we could see them lift on the world stage. I'm not sure that this country is doing it that much better than us. I'm unconvinced by that. I do think there's countries with specifically better programs. When you look at the rugby codes, that's a focus of New Zealand. Their footballers are nowhere near that, their soccer players are nowhere near that level. So I think that each country has their own specific interests. Our netball team, for instance, it's headed.
Aidan.
You go.
That's it. No, you go, please, Paul.
No, you sure?
Yes.
Oh, well, mine wasn't on. Mine's a slight change of topic, but I just had a question. With 72 days until myself and probably yourself are at the Women's World Cup opening game at Stadium Australia, it is a very mainland Australia event. There are no games in Tasmania. There are no training camps in Tasmania. I don't even know if there's any pre-event organisations at all. So with 72 games to go, what's the one piece of advice you'd give a Tasmanian premier organisation of how we can actually benefit from the absolutely vast range of benefits that we can have?
It's a really interesting one because I think it should have been spread around the country. It's obviously not my decision. And there was a bidding process. So for Tasmania, it's about throwing your hat in the ring and doing something bolshy. The other thing
Which we did.
think to what amount?
We had 4 potential base camps.
Yeah.
And we also tried for games, but there was nowhere in Tasmania to play.
I'm trying to remember exactly why.
Because the FIFA ruled that if you didn't have a playing venue, you couldn't have a training venue.
No, I understand that because they need to stay near that. But I thought there would be a warm-up camp, and I thought that came down to either the finances, but I think you're right.
No, it wasn't fine. It was down to travel.
And
we did get the government to agree to fund $200,000 for charter flights for it.
Damn it, that would be great. The one thing about World Cups, and this is specific to FIFA, is that you need a certain specification of stadium. And they are quite firm on this. There's no matches being played at Combank Stadium, which I think is the best football stadium in the country, as in rectangular sports stadium. And it's, only a few years old. And it needs to be a certain size. They need the countries get to choose their base camps. So that's actually.
Although the last 3 were allocated by FIFA.
There were 3 qualifiers because the other countries had chosen, yes. But the other thing that you need is a clean stadium. So no one else can play in your stadium.
We haven't got a stadium. There is no rectangular stadium in Tasmania.
Yeah, which is what I was getting at. It's like if you were hypothetically the Tasmanian Premier and.
Sorry, I was actually referring to other events you could do ancillary.
Yeah, like what's the best way for Tasmania to leverage into this tournament now in terms of like, should we send the Tourism Tasmania CEO to go to an expo? Should we go like try and get something there now that we've missed out on the bricks and mortar stuff that needs 2 years of planning?
I would get whoever your sports people are to make sure they're invited to those events, get on board with either, because there's going to be something in Victoria, there's going to be something in Adelaide, there's going to be something in Brisbane and Sydney, and Perth, from memory, has 4 games. That feels like so long ago. But I would make sure that there's some engagement or ability to engage in those events, and particularly around, I would now be looking further down the line, because 72 days is too close to affect anything in state, but look further down the line, and from a business and investment perspective, I'd be wanting to meet those people coming into town who are going to those events, who are looking to host something in Australia and then sell them Tasmania. And why wouldn't you?
So we're looking at trying to host the activation events during the World Cup. Maybe Hobart Mall with 5,000 people with the big screens and stuff. We couldn't even get a harmony pitch out of FIFA for Tasmania.
There's not that many of them around though.
Unity.
Unity pitch. What is it? Unity pitch.
So just to clarify with FIFA as well, I find this very confusing. It's the first time they've had an LOC. So it's a local organising committee as opposed to Zurich. But Zurich still makes the decisions, and then you've got a local organising committee, and then you've got all your like Football Tasmania, Football New South Wales, and all those sorts of things. So there's a lot of not so much fingers in the pie, but there's a lot of interests trying to be met. We are at Football New South Wales. I'm on their board. We are kicked out of our own facility because France is using it as a training base. They're not staying there, but no one else can use it. So all of our programs have to be moved out, and no one's allowed in our offices during that time. So there's certain things around that. The Harmony pitch was, they were used around the launch, and they are being used for the activations in the states they're in. But I would just try and garner as much public support as you can. Have you had a live site for anything before? A live site?
We had a couple for the Men's World Cup, but they were organised at quite late notice.
Yeah, I think everyone's was.
And they're also at the wrong.
Square, wasn't it?
Also, sort of at the wrong time. They're in the middle of the night, effectively, or really very early in the morning.
Fun part.
Yeah.
And the weather doesn't help.
Well, they're inside.
Yeah. And it was in summer. Yeah, no, for sure. So it is always going to be a challenge, but you need to get in the room to be able to talk it up, and that's the only way I can think of it. Also, I had a discussion with the New South Wales government, because when I was at Dubai Expo, the Victorian government and the Queensland government were both there, and I was there on 3 occasions, and they were there each time. I know it's the Com Games and the Olympic Games. Like that's a no-brainer, but staying in the conversation is part of that challenge. 72 days to go. Try and get tickets.
Not my fault.
Okay.
Thank you for your awesome presentation. And I love you talking about sort of the emancipatory value of sport, especially for women and young girls. I love the sport as an agent of change. And I'm appreciating you said it's a topic for another presentation. Mm-hmm. The evil twin of sports washing is sort of ever present. Yeah, it's there, and it's the bad guys who are doing it. So all those things you talk about human rights and those things that sport can promote. At the same time, we're seeing largesse of state wealth funds who are using it for other purposes. I personally, and I guess even at a government level, is there a concern at this?
Huge concern. You're not a Newcastle United fan, eh?
No, and I was going to say, no, I'm not. But Manchester United looks like it's about to be bought by a Qatar
And they will be, because
And we've
football
been
clubs
kicked out
are
of the
the
top four by them,
playthings
so-
of,
Right,
well, the barons.
yeah,
It's something I think I've struggled with. I'm a Manchester City fan, and
right.
I liked the club much more when it was poor, because there was a real up by your bootstraps sort of we've achieved this. Now we're hugely rich and never going to be beaten, and we've got Erling Haaland, so nothing else. But you watch it all around the world, and that trip to Saudi, I think, was the biggest eye opener for me, because ESPN wouldn't let me write the story that I went there to do. Because of the issues, obviously, around Jamal Khashoggi at the time, it was a couple of years ago. And it went up to legal, I think, 3 times. And I said, no, I'm writing about women's sport. And it was no, because of the public investment fund and all that sort of thing. So I went and looked up the public investment fund. They own shares in Disney, well, they did at the time, who were my employer because they owned ESPN. And I thought, okay, this is about a public perception. And there is a lot wrong on a human rights level. Ditto with Qatar and ditto probably with a number of those nations. But the reason I was invested in going there and having a look was because they were trying to effect change through sport, and it was life-changing for their women. They were playing behind that enclosed compounds in secret in the dark before. Now they're having a facility built for them so they could actually come and get changed. There were still families that didn't like their daughters playing sport, but they were equally embraced. Come when you can. If it's not okay with dad, we want you to respect him. And there was a real trying to work with people that I really liked. The obscene amounts of money, I don't know how that ever goes away, because there's always going to be someone that's going to take it. For example, if you look at Live Golf in Adelaide a couple of weekends ago, it was ridiculous how popular it was. And they had concerts, and they had DJ Fisher, who my children tell me I should know. It's apparently very famous, flew in from Coachella for one night to perform at the golf. And they're the sort of things you can do, and that creates a massive event where next year everyone will want to go because they heard about how huge it was. That's the sort of thing that those big dollars do. Is it right? No. It's going to take someone very brave to control it. I don't know where that ends, but it needs to be kept out of all the large sports. I'm still surprised that Qatar got to host the World Cup, and we know how that panned out. But even so, the World Cup was fine. Did it take away the smear of the human rights controversy around the building of their stadiums? No, because it was what you thought of when you saw any of the stadiums. So I think it's a difficult one. Are you in favour or not?
Of sports washing? No, I think it's done. No, I think it's really problematic. And I guess for the Qatar one, the counter argument is that it was good to focus on Qatar human rights. But I guess then when everyone leaves, there have been further investigations that Qatar have gone back to behaving badly as well now. So there's everything that you said about the benefits, I wholeheartedly agree with. There's just the post downside sometimes as well. And I guess London's the good news story. Qatar's the one that you wish it had have been better.
And I had hoped it would be. And that's the legacy item that we're talking about. The fact that you've got a spotlight in your country. And that's what I think a lot of journalists in Qatar tried to focus on, the fact that, okay, well, they have to be better because everyone's looking at them.
We've got 3 more minutes.
Oh,
We have a
sorry.
question from, sorry.
Get back to that.
The question, thank you, Matt. Thank you so much from the online group for such a wonderful talk. But the questions did centre a lot around sports washing, and that I guess all seems to overshadow all the good work that you can use in diplomacy. And the point that Matt was making about how do you stop it, and is it up to government to make a stand, and then where does the nexus end with politics and sport?
Well, it's a fine line, isn't it? What's the difference between sports washing and sports diplomacy?
That's a good question.
But when I've spoken, and so repeatedly, about how important our First Nations piece and in getting that right, is that airbrushing the fact that we got it so wrong. I don't know. It's all part of that same conversation. Of course, we're not throwing money at something to cover things up, but it is a very tricky one. I think it's.
I think the difference, perhaps you could argue, is that there's an acknowledgement with how we have a growing acknowledgement of how badly we have treated our Indigenous parts, whereas sports washing tends to look at this.
Yep.
And they don't acknowledge the.
And do you know the problem is, as long as there are people willing to attend and there's uptake,
Yes.
it becomes harder and harder. And my personal feel, and particularly on the Saudi money, is that they are going to continue putting on world events. I think that my feeling is that they will be aiming towards an Olympic Games. They will want a World Cup. They've already got the Men's Asian Cup in football. They've got their own Saudi Games and so on and so forth. They're westernising. Is it along the Red Sea? They're looking at having a wet zone where they're actually integrating with Western culture. And I think there's going to be no stopping them. So the only way to implement change is to have a voice at that event or a seat at the table.
They're also dipping into the IPL as
Oh,
well.
yes, yes. In fact, Pakistan had just been there when I was over there. So they're having conversations with everyone, and they have the money to attract sport because a lot of countries like ours have a limited budget, which is where we're talking about the program. So if someone was going to throw, $20 billion at your women's program, would you go and compete? It's a really difficult question, but no, you're absolutely right. It's a tough one.
So, Steffi, one last question. Where does that put the, FIFA, if you like, or the ICR, not the ICRC, the, Olympic committees? I mean, there don't seem to be any ethics in those committees. They're all.
Well, FIFA actually signed up Visit Saudi to be a sponsor of the Women's World Cup, which I thought was less around, it was a ridiculous idea. My information, it was bundled. It was the Club World Cup, it was the Asian Cup, and they got the Women's World Cup as a bonus. So I don't think it was specifically to sponsor the Women's World Cup, but my first interest was, why would you have a foreign country's tourism arm sponsoring your event for a start? Secondly, it was an odd one because of all the tournaments, this is the one where you're going to have a lot of the LGBTQIA plus community who want that safe space to play, and you're bringing someone that doesn't support that at all. So I thought that was absolutely insane. So I think there was that opportunity for the federations to speak up, and Australia and New Zealand football stood up to that really well, I thought. But it should have been a discussion that FIFA had already seen as no-go. Financially driven, perhaps. The IOC, I think, is held to account a lot more on that now, and they've got a sort of. I think there's more things at play there, and the athletes have a bigger voice. So that might be it.
Thanks.
Sorry to draw to a close. Thanks, Steph. Thanks, Aidan. Thanks, Greg, for a really thoughtful and interesting discussion. I think what Steph emphasised for me is that there is the country-to-country diplomacy, but there's also under that the people-to-people and people's organisations-to-people's organisations diplomacy, and maybe that's the one where we can make the longest-term difference without necessarily the money. So thank you very much. It was great to have you. Thanks, Aidan. Thanks, Greg. It was really good. Thanks.